All right, part 4. So we've just finished looking at communication channels as part of diffusion theory. Now we'll move on to our next component, but before we do, I just wanted to show you this, what we call the innovation diffusion S-curve. And if you've ever been exposed to this idea of diffusion theory before in any other courses, you probably will have seen this S-shaped curve. So all it shows is generally what we understand the innovation diffusion process to look like if we kind of visually map it out. So you can see on the vertical axis, you've got the percentage of adoption. So obviously the higher the percentage, the more people that are adopting innovation. You've got time along the horizontal axis there. So as you go along, it's obviously time is increasing. So what we know is that when we activate some of our earlier adopters of innovations, and again, I'll come to describing what those terms mean in a minute, but intuitively they make sense. People that adopt innovations earlier, there's not very many of them comparatively across the whole population of who it is you're trying to get the innovation to be diffused to, but you'll have a few early adopters, so they adopt things quite quickly. And then as you start to activate opinion leaders and change agents in your diffusion process, you start to increase the rate of adoption as time goes on, and eventually you start to get what you would hope is towards 100% of your target population adopting the innovation that you want to put into place, and that's where you start to bring on board what we call your later adopters. And so what that looks like when you start to map it out is that slight S-shaped curve. So it's just a way to visually see what the diffusion process overall looks like. So our third component of the theory is what we call time. So this relates to the individual adoption process. And basically all this is trying to break down for us the different stages that individuals go through when they're faced with a change, when they're faced with the adoption of a new way of working or a new product or a new process. There are 5 stages we suggest they go through. So firstly is about knowledge. Individuals want to then understand, okay, what is this innovation? What's it all about? Can you tell me some more about it? Then we go into persuasion stage, where you might have had through some of those mass media channels that we talked about before, and in an organisational sense, that might mean through organisational intranets, group meetings, team meetings, departmental meetings, all of those sorts of things. Knowledge has come at people, but then we get to persuasion, where you want some more of that interpersonal communication happening one-on-one, smaller group sort of communication where you're getting messages sent in richer formats to individuals, more clear and more detailed information about an innovation. Now, once individuals have gone through those 2 stages, they end up having to make a decision at some point about whether they're actually going to engage with the innovation, whether they're going to find out more about it, and ultimately whether they're going to adopt or reject it. And that's when we move into stage 4, where individuals actually say, okay, I'm going to implement this thing, I'm going to put it to use, I'm going to do this new way of working, I'm going to implement this new system, I'm going to try this new technology, etc. And the 5th stage, even though it's the last one, is probably one of the most important ones. So even if individuals make the choice to implement whatever the innovation is, that still needs to be reinforced over time. So there are many, many, many examples over the course of time where organisations have implemented innovations and people may well have adopted it. But then again, because we're inherently change-resistant entities as human beings, it's very easy for us to slip back to the status quo or slip back to what it is that we know best, what it is that we've done before. So the confirmation stage is where you really need to not decelerate necessarily your diffusion activities, but it can be a point of acceleration where you need to be reinforcing to people, it's great that you've adopted this and this is why we're doing it, continuing to provide support in terms of information, potentially training and those sorts of things to keep people using or engaging with and adopting whatever it is the innovation is. Otherwise, you can get that reversal of their decision where people actually end up discontinuing the use of an innovation. So ultimately, once you get past stage 5 or within stage 5, it's either full adoption or it's rejection of an innovation. And you can see those stages there mapped out. Again, visually, if you like to see it that way, that's the kind of stage process that we talk about innovation theory when we're looking at this innovation decision process, in diffusion theory. So ultimately, we've talked about this idea of reinvention before. It's just one of these things that if people are able to trial, experiment with an innovation as they're starting to adopt it, there's going to probably be a higher rate ultimately of adoption of that particular innovation. So if you let people play with it a little bit, generally they will adopt it faster and better and more sustainably. So that means that over time, once they get to that confirmation or last stage, fifth stage in that adoption process, if they've been able to test it and trial it a little bit, then generally over time, over longer periods of time, you'll get sustainable adoption of an innovation. Otherwise, you get discontinuance, which means people don't end up adopting it long term. And that might be because another idea supersedes it and you might be comfortable with that. There might be another innovation that comes over the top of it. Or it's disenchantment, discontinuance, which means people just get fed up and sick of whatever it is and say that dissatisfaction results in them just making the active choice not to engage with that innovation anymore. The next component of diffusion theory, and what I think this might be our last one or close to it, is a social system. So we've talked about this idea that innovation doesn't happen in a vacuum, but diffusion doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens within at least a small group of people and potentially a very large group of people. So this is touching on ideas we've talked about before, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but in a social system, there are a couple of critical people or groups of people that can help you in the diffusion process. One is those opinion leaders. Again, we've talked about those before, individuals who are highly central, influential, respected and seen as credible in an organisational network. They can help to diffuse your innovation and new messages quite quickly, as well as change agents who might not, or who usually are not part of the organisation, but are brought in from external places, external organisations or entities to help accelerate the diffusion process and manage the change process. I'm not going to focus, we don't need to focus very much on these types of innovation decisions, but just to know very broadly that when innovations are being implemented in organisations, either individuals can make the choice about that, whether they adopt it on their own. Sometimes it's a group decision as to whether an innovation is adopted, and sometimes it's a decision made by leaders in an organisation or managers who then impose that through, for example, their legitimate power or positional power or authority on others, simply by saying, this is something new we're going to do, and now I expect you to go and adopt it. Now here I want to talk a little bit about adopter categories. So I've talked about this before, so you've probably got a sense of these sorts of terms. So one of the key components of diffusion theory, if we think about it as a social system, is saying actually within that social system there are different categories of adopters of an innovation. And again, this comes back to one of those very early ideas that we talked about in diffusion theory, which is about segmenting your audience, identifying your target audience and tailoring your messages about your innovation to those different audiences. That stems from this idea of adopter categories. So within a social system, again, there are those different groups of people that have a propensity to adopt innovations. So we've got a few categories here, what we call innovators and early adopters. They're the ones, as the name suggests, who adopt new ideas quite quickly and quite early on. And you've got early majority adopters, late majority adopters, and laggards. So that kind of, if you think about it on a continuum over time, innovators, early adopters start early, and obviously the other ones start to come on board and engage with an innovation at later and later and later points in time. So if you search for adopter categories in any sort of research, you'll probably get a curve that looks like this. Basically what it's showing is that big line in the middle where you've got the big hump in the middle of the diagram there. And you've got the X that you can see on the horizontal axis there. Basically that's the average time to adoption of an innovation. So to the left of that X in the middle are the innovators and the early adopters. They're the ones who generally at earlier points in time adopt an innovation. And to the right there you can see at later points in time you get the late majority and the laggards who end up adopting an innovation. So it's a way for us to think about who is our audience. Can we identify who those early adopters are and target them in certain ways? Can we identify some opinion leaders and that sort of thing? in those early adopter categories to help us then bring on board more quickly the late majority and the laggards, the individuals that we know will be quite highly resistant to change or to our innovation, but they're still important for us to think about in this diffusion process. So early knowers of an innovation, so those earlier adopters when compared to later knowers or those laggards or late majority adopters, have some different characteristics. We don't need to worry about that too much, but I guess all I want you to take from this slide is to get a sense of, given those different adopter categories, we do know some things about how those different individuals operate. So for example, earlier adopters are generally individuals who are less dogmatic, so you can take that to be as less perhaps stuck in their ways. They have a greater ability to deal with change. They have a greater ability to deal with abstraction, which means, innovations, particularly at the very early stages, the information about them might still be developing, so there's probably a fairly high level of uncertainty when innovations first come into a market or first come into a unit for adoption. Early adopters generally handle that a little bit better than some of the other adopter categories. They generally have more favourable attitudes towards change, cope with uncertainty and risk better, etc., etc. So adopter categories, you can see in that second dot point there, also different in terms of communication behaviour. So earlier adopters are generally more socially active or engaged with their social networks. They're more connected in their networks, probably more central, probably have a combination of strong and weak ties, so they have access not just to people that they're close to and see all the time, but also access to wider and more diverse and disparate parts of an organisational network, so they're getting lots of new and novel information coming back to them and all of those sorts of things. And often they can have a higher degree of opinion leadership. So ideally, you want to be targeting those early adopter categories for your opinion leaders. But again, it's just a way for us to think about our different audiences and how we can tailor our strategies and communication messages to those different audiences. And this tells us a little bit more about the needs or motivations for these different adopter categories, which I think are useful to you. So why do innovators and early adopters actually do things faster and sooner than others? Well, it's because they generally like new things, they don't have much to use, and they generally have a propensity to try new and different things, as opposed to the larger majority, the later majority, and the laggards. Those are individuals who might be very comfortable with the way that things are, may be quite resistant to change, etc. But we know that as time goes on, remember that S-curve, that diffusion S-curve, over time, even those later adopter categories can and do begin to adopt innovations and take them on, and can do in a sustainable way. So generally for those later adopters, it's about activating your opinion leaders and your change agents that ultimately provides some impetus, or what we might call normative pressure, to fall into line. You can see in the last dot point there, fall into line or start to imitate what others are doing. So there's a social pressure effect there. Now, all I want you to take from this, so this is one of the last ones around diffusion theories, this idea of intervention clusters. I really only put this here because it may be useful for some of you in terms of your group case study reports. All intervention clusters talk about, all this term really means is, maybe you don't just have one innovation you're wanting people to adopt, you might have a range of complementary innovations that you're wanting people to adopt. So for example, if you're working in a bank, maybe you're introducing a new IT system or a new communication system, so that's one innovation. You might be at the same time introducing a process innovation where you're asking people to change the way that they go about doing their work, and that might be related to your IT or communication system innovation. You might have a couple of other changes in terms of products that people need to be using or processes that people need to be using, and so they might all be linked together. But in essence, you've got a cluster of innovations that you're trying to implement, which just means a few all at once. So you can engage in some clustering of innovations. What that can do is actually help the adoption process, because if you bring all of those in at the same time, you can heighten your rate of adoption, as opposed to if you were just bringing those innovations in bit by bit at different points in time, you can start to overwhelm people and it becomes more difficult to accelerate the adoption process, I suppose. So all I want you to know there is that it can be effective if you've got multiple innovations that you need to be implementing, to do that all at once and engaging in your diffusion tactics all at once at the same time to reinforce the adoption of all of those innovations. So just lastly, what does diffusion theory tell us and why do we care? Well, it's really about recognising that innovations are adopted in different ways. Some are adopted quickly, some are adopted slowly. This theory is trying to help us understand why there is a difference there. So it focuses on those key components that we've just gone through in some detail. What are the attributes of innovation? Think about how you're communicating those different attributes. Think about the messages that you're using. Think about your adopted categories. Think about your different audience and breaking them down into those different categories and targeting your messages in different ways. And thinking about how you identify and activate some critical people in an organisational network. Those opinion leaders particularly, those who are quite central, respected, credible, or probably have referent power within an organisational network, activating those individuals to help reinforce your messages and diffuse your innovation. And also your change agents, so external people you can bring in to support your diffusion process. So it's really trying to give us, I guess, a toolkit of strategies and things that we can use to encourage the relative speed or uptake or adoption of our particular innovation. Now, that's quite a scary slide and quite a scary visual diagram there, so I don't expect you to memorize that or know every part of it. It's simply to show that diffusion is a very complex process. So there are lots of different facets involved in it, from the individual adopter themselves through to the organisational system that you're embedded in, through to the context and external environment outside of your organisational system, etc., etc. So don't get hung up on this slide. All I wanted to do in putting this up and showing you this is to know diffusion is complex. We've broken it down to a few key components, and that's what I want you to focus on. But just to know there are a lot of different things that we can think about in terms of diffusion and that are important when we are thinking about diffusion. But please don't think you need to memorise this slide. I would not expect that. So let's take a break and we'll come to the last part of this lecture. We can move through this fairly quickly. We're going to look at some different models focused on individual behaviour change.